So I'm going to change the game a little bit. Instead of asking really difficult questions because it's easier on me, I'm going to put it on you guys. Whoever, the two people who interact the most and want to provide the most input, those are yours. So it's all on y'all. Like Ed said, my name is John Byrd. I've been working as a cloud security engineer for the past 2 years at BBVA, implementing and designing cloud governance and security controls and implementing them at scale. I originally looked at this and thought about coming in to talk about multiple account strategy and all the cool stuff about it and all of the ins and outs and all of the ways that you can make it work to your advantage. And then I realized there was absolutely no way I was going to be able to get to all of that within one session. So if this is a conversation that you guys find interesting and you want to talk more, or you want me to come back and talk more about multiple accounts, we run about 150 accounts right now across all workloads within AWS. So I've got a little bit of hands-on experience. I'd be happy to talk to you guys about it. So starting with organizations, want to kind of get a feel. I know I've had a couple of conversations with you guys already, but who is currently running multiple accounts in AWS? Sweet. All right. Are any of you guys responsible for the account creation process? Awesome. We need to talk afterwards. So are all of you familiar with the organization's service? Okay, cool. I'm going to skip through some of this other stuff. Basically, what I want to kind of get a feel for where you guys are, and you guys already gave me the warm fuzzies. You guys are aware, kind of on the same page. So AWS gives you a lot of reasons why to use multi-accounts, or to use a multi-account strategy. Of those, you have billing is the first highlighted advantage. With isolating your billing to individual workloads within accounts, you're really truly able to see a total cost of ownership of those workloads. You can do tagging, and there are shared services that you also have to take into consideration. But if you're talking about seeing a boundary for billing, providing an account is a hard set boundary that's very easy to work with. Similar to that, you also have administration boundaries. So if I'm an administrator on account A, I may not have any access at all to account B. That's the way most things work when you're talking about servers, when you're talking about environments with on-prem environments. So having that boundary for administration isolation is a critical part in the way that you control access to your multiple accounts. Also talking about decentralization, there are some soft limits that you can increase per service within AWS, but then there are some that are just hard set limits. One of those is the API calls, for example. So if you have a very robust application that has making a bunch of API calls, and you have another robust application making a bunch of API calls, at some point you're going to hit a limit that AWS can handle, and one or more of those workloads are going to be impacted. By spreading it out and decentralizing it, you're able to spread out that workload, and AWS is happy to accommodate your limits as far as that's concerned. How many of you guys are using or are familiar with reserved instances? Cool. So right now, when you go to purchase a reserved instance, you can purchase a reserved instance on an account level. With the implementation of organizations, you're actually able to do shared reserved instances. So if you're wanting to provide multiple accounts with a centralized billing capacity for reserved instances, you can do that. Or you can actually separate them out and segment them out into individual accounts, thereby back to the billing conversation we were having earlier. These are the two biggest reasons that I love the organization's the multi-account strategy. Being a security guy, I like boundaries. They make me feel warm and fuzzy. So if I can say 100% that someone who is accessing this account has absolutely no way to access this other account. Now, that has to be done with IAM policies, guardrails, so on and so forth. But the reduction of that blast radius to a single account means that if that single account's compromised, you're not looking at a enterprise-wide compromise. It's isolated to a single workload, and it reduces the footprint that you have to do forensics on and clean up on. Speaking of forensics, the use of a centralized logging account makes logging and security functionality and operations so much better. Having a centralized account where all of the logs are going to, where you're able to tie it back to individual member accounts, especially when you're talking about third-party applications like Elk or Splunk, where it's actually parsing through data, you're able to point it to a single source instead of having to aggregate it across hundreds of accounts. Some of the other advantages that I'm also kind of partial to, as soon as you enable organizations, the first thing right out of the gate is you're going to realize that you've consolidated your bill. So that's something to be aware of, but it's also an advantage in the sense that instead of managing multiple bills that may be hitting, well, they'll all be hitting at the same time, but instead of managing multiple bills from multiple accounts, you have a consolidated view of your bill holistically while still being able to break down and look at your per account spend. I was talking to Ed about this when before everybody came in, and one of my favorite pieces of the organization service is the addition of the CLI. So the people who are responsible for creating accounts, are you guys using organizations to create accounts, or are you creating accounts on the fly? With org? Okay, cool. So being able to create new accounts with a single API call with the organization's create account, if you've ever gone through the process of creating a new account, much less dozens of new accounts, and then tying them to an organization, this is a lot easier. I'll just leave it at that. So from the governance, you have service control policies and organizational units. If you guys are familiar with organizational units within Active Directory, it works similar to that. There are some caveats to that, but we'll touch on both of those later. And then more recently, they've introduced tagging for accounts. So if you are going through and building new accounts within your master billing account, you have the ability to add additional metadata in the form of tags to the account object itself. This sounds kind of basic, but once you start thinking about the size and the scale of hundreds of accounts and being able to aggregate those and work with those programmatically, it makes a huge difference. So is everyone familiar with resource policies and how they work roughly? Okay, so a resource policy exists on a resource itself. The biggest differentiator between a resource policy and an IAM policy is going to be the existence of the principal statement or the principal key in the statement. That's basically saying this principal has these rights to the resource that this policy is attached to. And typically what you do is you specify the principal, and in this case, this is an example of an S3 bucket statement that is wide open to the internet, or wide open to the world with this AWS star. By adding the condition down here, you're actually, with organizations, you have the ability to specify a principal org ID. When you create your organization, you're assigned an identifier basically. There's no way to currently add organizational unit identifiers to resource policies, but I can't imagine that that's not coming soon. At this point though, use case that I could give you for this would be if in the previous conversation we were having about a centralized logging account, this lets you basically say, I don't care what account it is, as long as it's a member of my account, I expect that you're going to be able to put objects into this bucket because this is the centralized logging bucket and that's all you really need to be able to do with it. Does this make sense to everyone? Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have a strategy for governing who can write or what prefixes?
You can. You would be able to specify it using the org principal ID, but you would still have to specify the resource in the policy itself. But yeah, you could definitely do it that way, and then simply use the organizational ID as another filter level as you're adding additional governance and controls. So let's talk about the OUs themselves. AWS provides 3 basic OU structures. I'm going to kind of go through those relatively quickly, but ask any questions. This first one is basically built around the lines of business. And this is designed where if you're going to apply governance or security controls to individual lines of business or individual departments, where you want, say, everyone in IT department to have elevated permissions and less restrictive controls. But in accounting, you want to make sure that everything is locked down as solid as possible. You're able to differentiate those OUs and actually apply service control policies, which I'll explain further in a second, at the OU level. So the second option would be looking at the development lifecycle stages. This is one that I'm partial to and one that we actually have in production. So you have a breakdown of each stage in the software development lifecycle. In this instance, you're talking about test or development, test, and production. The thought would be that your production OU would have the most locked down, most stringent controls because no one should be accessing those accounts. Or there should be very limited access to those accounts. From a test and development OU, you're probably going to have more lax controls because you're going to want people to go in and try to beat stuff up and tear it up. The last option, or the last example that they give is broken down into projects or workloads. So if you have a specific workload and you have multiple development, production, and QA environments with those workloads, you could actually end up grouping them within the OUs, which is basically going to provide a holistic governance around an entire project. And instead of breaking it up per stages, you're breaking it up per teams with their exposure to the environment. This works really well from a DevOps perspective because you're basically saying everything in this OU you have access to and you can do whatever you need to within these boundaries. So does anybody have questions about the OUs? And I know I realize now that I've done something a little out of order and I probably could have explained it a little bit better. So with that being said, is everyone on pace? Do you have questions so far?
So considering you said you guys have hundreds, it seems like you have a mix of those strategies.
Almost. So our primary strategy is around the software development lifecycle stages. We acknowledge that there are some accounts that exist outside of these. For example, our centralized logging account, our management accounts, consolidated billing account. All of those exist outside of these three OUs, but within these three OUs is where we have all of the other accounts. So if it's a production environment or it's running in a production capacity, it's in that OU with those restrictions in place. And similarly with development and QA as well. But yes, that's a very valid point. There is no limitation to the way that you can mix and match these hierarchies. This is showing an all or nothing approach, but you can definitely go in and tweak these as much as possible and actually combine them like you were saying. So who is deploying infrastructure with CloudFormation currently? Sweet. So are you deploying it to individual accounts for infrastructure, or are you building out governance, and how much are you using CloudFormation? Okay. So at this point, what you can actually do is, with the use of organizations, you have the option to deploy to organizational units. So there are a lot of caveats here that I could spend a lot of time on. I'm not going to bore you guys, but think of it as a point of entry for deploying infrastructure as code at an organizational level. To make this more tangible, when we create a new account, we have a list of stacks that we deploy to a new account based on the level, the stage of the life cycle that it's in within software development. And so depending on the associated stack sets through CloudFormation, we deploy all of our infrastructure as code and all of our roles as code, everything through CloudFormation before handing it over to the business. That way, as soon as they get it, it's a standard experience for them, and it's relatively clear cut as to what to do next. Just like with the CloudFormation deployments, you can also associate service control policies with OUs or at the OU level. Think of a service control policy as a group policy. It's a forced inheritance policy. So if you have a policy that's applied at a parent OU, everyone is going to get it beneath that parent OU regardless. So again, another example of a lot of granularity that we can go into, but that means that you need to get kind of creative when you're talking about the way that you're building service control policies, especially if you're talking about a hierarchical implementation, because if you deny something at this level, it's denied for everything beneath it. So this is where you're able to start looking at blacklists versus whitelists and making determinations as to the best way that you really want to do the governance of service and permission limitation at the account level. Service control policies are really cool because they're basically they're the first and last step as far as, well, usually the first step as far as evaluations go for when you're actually getting evaluated for your permissions. Without going through this in detail, right here basically what I'm showing is the organization service control policies get evaluated immediately after any explicit denies on the API calls that are being made. So this is the phase or the order in which your IAM policies are evaluated. Service control policies are right there up front. And the way this basically works is service control policies function as an upper limit for the permissions that can be executed on an account. Doesn't grant any access. Just because you have ***, as is seen in the full AWS access service control policy, this simply means that you have the ability to use all of the services from that account. If you add a deny here, I'm kind of jumping ahead, but if you add a deny here, you're denying that across all of those service control policies and all of the accounts that are associated with it. So what you end up seeing is the beginning of a full AWS access service control policy, and then you start whittling down and you say, I don't want to allow Alexa. I don't want to allow CloudFront because we don't want to provide public-facing resources. And then you go through and you can blacklist these individual services or permissions and then more finally ingrain them into a whitelist policy, so you're only allowing exactly what you want to be allowed. That's a major pain to do and it takes a lot of effort, but the advantage of this is, especially from a security perspective, AWS innovates and comes out with new services all the time. If they come out with a service that is a fantastic service that has been tested and thoroughly vetted, but hasn't been vetted through our security team, hasn't been evaluated from our architecture team, I don't want my users using it. That's not to say I don't want them using the service, it's I need to evaluate the best way to implement that to make sure that the governance that we have in place correctly is assigned to the service before it goes into production. I know I've kind of digressed a little bit from full AWS access, but does that make sense from a deny and an allow standpoint?
How many policies do you have?
So, interesting story about that. Service control policies are limited to 5 service control policies per object. So, let me rephrase that. They're limited to 5 direct assignments. I'm trying to think about the best way to word this. An object in an organization can only be directly assigned 5 service control policies. So if it inherits additional service control policies from higher up, it can exceed that 5, but as far as directly tied, you only have the option of 5. So the reason I say that, to answer your question, is I would love to have a ton of very granular, very specific service control policies, but there's limitations. So you have to end up combining the logical explanations or the logical groupings of those restrictions. I've reached out to AWS. They haven't given me any input on when that may change, but I'm definitely not the only person that's complained about that. To answer your question though, we have about 3 or so applied at each level directly, depending on what it's doing, where it's at within the organization, and what the service control policy is doing.
I'm trying to get a sense of like the management of the policies.
Sure.
You've got 1,000 of them. Is there additional tooling that you purchase third party to help manage that, or is it just a bunch of text files and you?
So I hadn't planned on showing because none of this is very enthralling to see on a console, but you're basically looking at a list of service control policies that exist within organizations, and then you look at the ones that are associated with it within the organization's console. To answer your question, it's not, it leaves a lot to be desired. There is a lot of improvement that could work with that to let it be a little bit more visual, a little bit more mature as far as the enterprise is concerned. But you do see a limitation on the size of the actual service control policies and a limit on the number of service control policies that you can attach. So you have to know where within this you're really wanting to have those permissions evaluated. So from a service control policy is applied to every IAM entity on the account. That includes the root user. So if you're logging in with a root user to an account that has a deny on it, that root user cannot use that service, that permission, what have you. So service control policies are incredibly powerful and should be used only for the least common denominator. Put it that way. Let's not talk about that. We won't talk about how many times I've locked myself or others out. Yeah, so another example of this, we have specified specific regions that we want our environments to be built in currently. Just it reduces the blast radius, it gives us specific idea as to what's being built where, and it also helps us identify architecture for what regions should be used within our design. So we want to make sure that everyone is only using one of those two regions. By having a service control policy that's a deny at the top level, it denies all API calls in this instance for every region outside of US East 1 and West 1. So if you go and you log in, which is very common, and you go to look at the IAM screen and suddenly you have no rights to do anything, it's usually a call to me, John, you screwed my access. The modern day turn it back off and on again is what region are you in? You're in Ohio.
So a question on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Does that have any impacts that you didn't expect, like where a certain service might be using another region under the covers?
I will say it has not negatively impacted us from a region perspective, but with that being said, we are using East 1. So if you are looking at using something like this, there are a lot of services that I think you're kind of getting at that rely on East 1 specifically. IAM, for example, don't disallow East 1. Just another example would be creating So in the instance that you've actually created a break glass role. So we've got all these permissions in place. We've put everything in place to make sure that we've locked everything down. But now, crap, something's gone wrong and we've got to get in. Well, you're going to want to have a break glass role to be able to get in. Pinning that conversation, you also want to make sure that that break glass role isn't modified, isn't used, isn't leveraged by anybody outside of specific people that have intentions on using it. So one of the ways that you can actually do this is to actually go through and set up a deny for anybody making any modifications to this break glass role. That can be done at the service control policy level, which basically means anyone, including the root user, if they log in and they want to make modifications to this Uber role, they can't. Does this kind of make sense with everyone? Cool.
Question, sorry.
No, yeah, go ahead.
Does that mean you set that assume role policy and then you apply this SCP? Because when you need to use it, or I guess when you need to use it, you can drop this SCP and then add the assume role policy to let people actually use it.
So the way that you would end up doing it would be, this is going to limit the actions for the local account to make modifications to this role. This isn't going to prevent other accounts from making those API calls to this role. So this is going to prevent people from logging in and saying, you know what, this break glass role needs to only have read only. They're not going to be able to do it on the local account.
Okay, sorry.
No, you're good. Trust me, IAM is not clear. Like, it's not very straightforward, especially when you start adding not actions, denies, not resources. Things can get creative. I talked about this a little bit earlier. You have the option of going with a blacklist or a whitelist for service control policies. The ideal way to start would be building out a blacklist, identify what you know you don't want, and then slowly transition into a whitelist. With that being said, and just like I was saying, as soon as you start implementing service control, or once you start implementing variations on the allow and deny, the not resource, you start having exceptions to service control policies that don't exist within IAM policies. If you're not aware that these exceptions exist, it makes your life very confusing for a long period of time until you call support and have them explain to you that this already exists and is documented, and they point you to the right link on the website. Hopefully I can save all of you guys a little bit of time. But one of the things that is really powerful is being able to do denies with not actions, denies with resources, and denies with conditions, but not being able to do allows with those. I'm going to leave that with you guys to let you decipher through why technically that becomes very complicated. But once you go back to that IAM evaluation process, you'll realize how it gets kind of messy, which is why they've technically limited allow for those statements or those policy elements. Does that make sense? It's like I said, IAM is not the most direct, straightforward way to explain things. So now putting it to use, the best thing from an automation standpoint that we've seen is being able to pack all of this into a CLI command, build an account, enable automation to build out the guard duty connector, the security hub connection, all of the other stuff from a governance and security perspective that we want to make sure is included in each of the accounts. And using organizations basically allows you to do that through a combination of service control policies and deployment of cloud formations that at scale just didn't cleanly exist without them. And like you asked, there's a reason that I do say please test service control policies. It's probably best to have a separate OU entirely, and keep in mind that the OU for testing, when you make that OU, it's going to have the full AWS access policy. So at that point, you're going to start modifying full AWS access policy without, just be aware of where the full access policy lives. I'll put it that way. Additionally, make sure and take advantage of the tagging through the account structure. The metadata that you're going to get from that is potentially really beneficial. I didn't explicitly go over it because it's technically on other services, but organizational level CloudTrail and organizational level config rules are awesome. We were previously deploying CloudTrail through a CloudFormation, deploying a username, log group, CloudWatch integration, naming the CloudTrail, doing all of that per account when we created the account. Now with organizational level CloudTrail, you just don't, and you check a single box in the billing account and it's applied. So it's really powerful. AWS is beginning to pay attention to enterprise customers more than they have previously. I feel over the past 2 years, it's moved further from hey, get your new small app stood up and get it running quick, to a legitimate enterprise support and scalable solution. What questions can I answer? I can see the hamster wheels going.
Did you have individual CloudTrails aggregating?
Yes.
Before? Did it break like hell when you checked the box?
Oh yeah, yes and no. What we actually did was, to make sure that didn't happen, we created a second centralized location for the logs to go to, pointed that CloudTrail, so we actually had 2 CloudTrails associated with every account for a short time. That way there was no lapse in the logs that we had, switched off the old one, and the organization all aggregated to a single bucket. I was gonna say, the ability to flip it on though is ridiculously easy compared to the work that you went through to deploy it. It's decentralized.
So there's always that balance between, control and security and then speed and how quickly an organization can use new services. Do you feel like implementing more, lockdown policy slows you guys down at all? If not, how do you stop that from happening?
So I'm glad you asked the question. My biggest thing as a security person is I hate saying no. That's weird of a response from a security person, but I get when security says no, I've been on the other end of it. You don't go anywhere. You don't do anything. You can't make progress. So the question or the response instead of no is how or what specifically. So just like the service control policy, applying it at the least common denominator is really where you should start. For example, we've done naming conventions with all of our resources. So when we deploy it, we deploy with a very specific naming convention. There is a single service control policy that associates or addresses each of those resource naming conventions and provides denies at the account level. So I recently went through when I went through to change the CloudTrail, I actually got an error through CloudFormation saying you don't have rights to modify any of these. Kind of freaked out for a minute because I forgot that I had enabled the service control policy. But even from the billing account, deploying to the member accounts, the service control policy still trumps the master billing account. So to answer your question, as least restrictive as possible, put guardrails in place more than anything else. I would rather people have as much leeway to do what they need to and bounce against the guardrails than come to me and say, hey, why can't I do this? As opposed to say, you can't do that. So it's very fine line to do, but it's doable. No, so I was talking to Ed about this. We've actually gone through to build a end-to-end automation process. So when we start the account creation process, I collect 6 points of data, just usernames for specific people, specific naming conventions for the workload, so on and so forth, and then I hit go. And then as soon as I hit go, I walk away. When I come back 5.5, 6 minutes later, I've got a new account set up with GuardDuty integrated, Macy integrated, Security Hub set up, IAM identity provider set up, IAM roles, all the policies, guardrails applied, moved to the correct OU. Yeah, so I mean, the automation, after that piece is done, we hand it over to the DevOps team, and then they begin the workload provisioning through Terraform and Jenkins. So by the time the line of business gets the account, they're ready to build. Gotcha. It says, hey, I want to create a new account and deploy all the stacks to that account. Give me 6 months. We're working on it. So the goal would be long-term to do a JIRA Webhook that, based off an approval process, once the approval is done, kicks off this process from a service account, and then it's all done. So that is the goal, but at this point, we still have manual governance and oversight that we're applying to make sure that we're slowly making the transition in the right direction.
So that kind of leads to the question. Talk earlier about, what your strategy was as far as OU breakdown goes. For individual accounts, do you tend to align those around a project, around a team?
So the way that we've seen work well, specifically with our automation process, is every account or every workload basically gets 3 accounts right out of the gate: development, a QA, and a production. And all 3 of those accounts are created at the time of the initial request. And so a CI/CD pipeline is actually deployed across all of these 3 accounts. So the goal would be, when everything is said and done, a request come in, goes through the approval, the account gets created, it gets passed to another team, which also has automation processes that build out a pipeline, and then hand it over to the end user, and the end user is able to use that Jenkins pipeline to start deploying code through, the Jenkins pipeline using Terraform modules to deploy as code, and all the Terraform modules we have specifically built and a prescriptive build for everything, slowly.
Do you centralize the management of the roles for users, or do you just create the account and then let whoever's going to own the account add the given role?
We actually have standardized roles across all accounts, so that way you have the expectation of knowing exactly what level permissions each of these roles have, and then based off of the job role or the function of the person, you're able to assign those to one of these standard roles. If there's variation and they need more or less access, you have to make the determination as to what are these standard roles. Non-standard, I hate. Like it becomes very tedious to manage. So if we can deploy everything with very standard naming conventions, very standard build processes, it makes automation possible.
How many standard roles do y'all deploy?
It's funny you asked that question. Currently 8. As of after I get done having this conversation with audit, 4. And the reason being is we started building out a bunch of roles for very specific use cases, and it made sense at the time. Once we started looking at how the CI/CD pipeline was being leveraged and who was logging in and assuming roles, we realized that it makes more sense to streamline the number of roles and give more boxed canned permissions associated with them. Think of it as like a read-only, a power user, and administrator.
Have you looked at landing zone at all? Are you so far past that? It's unbelievable.
Okay, so landing zone. I spent 6 months building a script to automate this entire process for account creation. I take it to our TAM, and I'm like, hey, Neil, check this out. He goes, I need to talk to you. Talks about landing zone, talks about control tower. I get really frustrated, my blood pressure goes up. Then I realize that it's only usable for new accounts and new organizations. So currently, to deploy using control tower, you have to have a fresh organization. It looks awesome, it looks very promising, but we would have to go back and, like you said, we would have to redo everything to make it conform with it. And from our standpoint, it's not valuable at this point. If you're starting from scratch, building a new organization, absolutely check out Control Tower.
Maybe switch on top of it.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier around service limits
Mhm.
across accounts. You've got hundreds of accounts. How on earth are you tracking your service limit consumption across that many?
I hate to say it this way, but it's not a problem until it's a problem. Especially when you're talking.
It's too late. It's already a problem.
It was a big problem when it was a problem. When it became a problem, it was a big problem real quick. That is. Say again.
It's the thing we're currently struggling with, which is why.
If you're hitting API call limits, you definitely need to start distributing your.
Not so much that. It's more like, by default, you can build this many cards.
Oh, you're talking. Okay, I'm sorry. So you're talking about service. I got you. You're talking about soft limits. So like when you build a new account. All right. So there are 2 ways that we address that. Prior to them coming out with a new service called service quotas, which definitely look into. It's really awesome. It's really simple. We were scripting a support ticket at the time of creation of the account. And the support ticket said, hey, we need this, and this increased. And we just had a standard thing that said, hey, increased all of it right out of the gate. Because we knew for a fact that 5 EIPs or 4 subnet, it's not going to fit for us. So we need to have at least X number. What we've done now is, well, I haven't made this transition yet, but one of the things I want to do is to transition that off of a support ticket and start using the service quota request. Unfortunately, when they implemented the service quota requests or the service quota service, they restricted your requests to instance type as well. So instead of saying, hey, I need to be able to create 200 EC2s in my instance, now it's I need to create 200 2x or T2 4XLs. I need to create 100 C4 XLs. You have to specify. So it's kind of tedious, but it's something that I would definitely recommend looking at service quotas for. What else can I answer for you guys? I'm really glad to see everyone looking up and around, trying to figure out, thinking through all the stuff. I'm much better than having a blank stare, so I appreciate that, even if it's just for my own amusement.
Is there a good tool to visualize all the IAM principles that you apply?
So what we actually use for Aggregation, because now that you've decentralized everything, you need to have a way to view everything holistically. We use Cloud Health, and that's our, not an asset manager by any means, but it is what we use to reference the resources that we have and use for compliance checks, security recommendations, so on and so forth.
As far as if I want to take a user or a role and view what principles are being applied.
Oh, so that's cool. The way that we've actually got roles being assigned, we use ADFS Federated Services. We use the ADFS Federation blog that they've released. So the way it works is every individual role is assigned to an AD group within Active Directory. So by adding a person directly to a role, and they all have standard roles, they also have standard AD security groups. So adding them to a security group adds them directly to that role within AWS. So when we go through the account creation process, we identify the technical owner being one of the things that we capture. We say, you know what, you're going to already need read-only access. We're going to go ahead and throw you in the read-only group for that account, as an example. Yes, sir. Say again. With what? Oh no, not at all. No, I wrote the entire. This is where I'm going to get scoffed at. I wrote the entire account creation process in PowerShell for that reason. Okay.
It's about using ADFS for API calls?
Well.
What do you use for somebody wants to use the CLI?
Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. We're actually. I'll plug a utility that one of my coworkers tweaked to our use. It's STSOFF is what we're using to connect programmatically. And so which is available on GitHub. If you want to check it out, feel free to. It's publicly available. STSOFF, one word. We have Okta for MFA in front of our ADFS authentication. STSOFF actually takes the token for your MFA, pushes it against the ADFS, authenticates you in, and then gives you programmatic access. So when you actually, have you ever used the single sign-on for the single sign-on page for AWS authentication? It lists all of the accounts and then lists all of the roles underneath it. It lists out exactly that inside a terminal window.
So I'll throw another option out there. We do something similar.
Yes.
We have 17 different accounts. We use Jump Cloud as our IDP. Same methodology. We have 3 roles that we throw out by default. The SAML to AWS is another tool that's written in Python on GitHub. You can configure each individual account with a role assignment you want to jump to. You just type SAML AWS login in the account, and it prompts you for username, password, MFA, and then it assigns it to the memory.
There's also, these are all a little different, each use case, but there's also ALKS, which was created by Cox Automotive. That's Airlift Key Service. It's basically provisioning temporal access keys that expire after however long, and then you can just authenticate using that. It's a really cool service, but it does require some infrastructure and configuration and whatnot. We used ADFS because it's it's what we use for authentication. We just added it in through AWS with MFA in front of it, so we've got MFA authentication as well. Yeah, so. So, without going into a lot of detail, we have a series of accounts that we use for the pipeline itself. So all of the tools, the shared tools for the pipeline, including all of our supporting DevOps tools, are in this set of accounts. And then for deployment, we're using CloudBees, which is Enterprise Jenkins. So that's where it initiates the pipeline from and then builds it out into each of the accounts from there. It's a really vague explanation. I can give you more detail, but it's a pain to kind of go through and explain. But as far as centralized apps outside of pipeline, for the most part, depending on the maturity of the application, kind of determines the way in which we can leverage them. Cloud Health is really great with role-based access. It makes it really easy to authenticate. You can do API-based configuration for the tool, and it just authenticates to each account and pulls back information. That model is by far better than any of the other models. But yeah, it's a per use case situation. Yes.
How difficult have you found it to be to grant proper serverless access to people to do what they think they can do versus saying you're not allowed to do, like, you're allowed to do this subset of things via serverless, you're not allowed to do these subset of things. How difficult of balancing that is?
Are you specifically saying what you can build or what you can use from the services?
Specific use case for us is, we have people asking us for serverless things where they're going in, like, building a bunch of infrastructure inside of our serverless to try to determine, like,
they're building their own
you're allowed to do
utilities.
this law, but you're not allowed to do this.
Gotcha.
That seems to get really,
So
the permission sets get really complicated with that.
the best way that I could tell you to do it, and this is all queued up for another presentation in the future, start looking at permission boundaries, excuse me, and start requiring the roles that they create to have boundary permissions that restrict them from doing certain things. So when they use that as a role that they attach to a Lambda, that Lambda role, execution role, still has upper limits. So they can build whatever, they can put whatever permissions they want on it. As long as that permission boundary exists, there's an upper limit for what they can do and what that role can do. So it's just a go wild. You can't do these things, I'm fine. Again, it goes back to guardrails.
Really, it sounds like a more granular strategy to fix a lot of the problems we've run into as well. Because one of our challenges is you bring permissions to do a thing on an account and then broader.
Right, because you can't say, hey, you need permission to do this. It's, hey, you need this specific permission to do it on this specific resource. And then you have to either explicitly identify that resource or end up putting some wildcard in place that may or may not match the resource exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. And especially when you're talking about the standardization of naming conventions, of resource types, everything, automation for sure makes your life a lot easier. Now I'm getting more blank stares than pondering thoughts, so I think we're good. If anybody has any more questions or anything, just holler at me. Be happy to talk to you. Oh, yeah. The two gentlemen at the end of the table for pestering and asking all the questions. I appreciate it. Thanks again, guys.